Around 5,000 years ago, in what is now Latvia, a young man in his 20s lay dying. He had no visible wounds, showed no signs of starvation or thirst, and yet life was slipping away from him. At the same time, far to the north in Sweden, a young woman also found herself in the same condition, healthy in appearance, but succumbing to the same mysterious torment. Neither knew the other, nor had they ever crossed paths, but within days both would be gone. And they were not alone. Across vast distances, countless others began to fall victim to the same unseen force, an invisible killer that some scientists today suspect may have played a role in the dramatic decline of human populations during the late Neolithic. That culprit is believed to be Yersinia pestis, a microscopic enemy many may not recognize by its scientific name, but certainly know by its devastating legacy, the plague. This is the same disease responsible for the Black Death and the Plague of Justinian, two of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, which together wiped out vast portions of humanity. Some researchers now argue that long before those infamous outbreaks, this pathogen may have sparked an earlier wave of destruction, striking communities across Eurasia thousands of years ago. For decades, scientists knew that Yersinia pestis had ancient roots emerging between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago from a relative called Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. The long-standing theory was that the bacteria remained relatively dormant, only becoming catastrophic much later in history. But that assumption began to unravel when archaeologists started uncovering the remains of dozens of Neolithic individuals whose teeth and skulls still carried traces of the bacteria in their bloodstreams. Considering that the plague's various forms septicemic, bubonic, and pneumonic carry extremely high death rates, often exceeding 90% without treatment, it became clear that these people likely died from the infection. At first, the discovery wasn't considered extraordinary. After all, infectious diseases were common in ancient times, and remains often show signs of lethal illnesses. But the discoveries didn't stop. More and more plague victims turned up, spread across wide regions. Entire families were found affected, and in some places, mass graves revealed the scale of devastation. What truly caught the attention of scholars was the timing these deaths aligned with a broader demographic collapse known as the Neolithic decline. This collapse occurred between 3450 and 3000 BC when populations across Eurasia suddenly shrank by up to half, wiping out centuries of growth brought on by the rise of farming. No one knew the exact cause, but the plague's presence seemed far too coincidental. Adding to this was the fact that human societies at the time had reached a size and density where pandemics became more plausible. Massive settlements, often called mega-settlements, were spreading, such as Maidanetsky in present-day Ukraine, which housed up to 50,000 people in thousands of dwellings. Living so closely together without proper sanitation created the perfect breeding ground for infectious disease. These settlements also stored large reserves of grain, which inevitably attracted rodents. The fleas carried by those rodents happened to be the perfect carriers of Yersinia pestis. Together, these conditions formed an ideal environment for the disease to spread uncontrollably. Evidence suggests that some of these large settlements eventually collapsed, with many homes left abandoned or deliberately burned, possibly an attempt to destroy the contagion and keep it from spreading further. The pattern was too striking to ignore. As researchers broadened their investigations beyond the already known plague victims and into untouched burial sites, they realized the epidemic had been far more widespread than once believed. What once seemed like isolated tragedies now appeared to be signs of a sweeping ancient pandemic, one that may have changed the course of early human history. From the study of more than 100 skeletons uncovered across Scandinavia, researchers determined that nearly 17% of those individuals had been infected with the plague and died from it. The picture grew even darker when archaeologists found a mass grave containing the remains of a single extended family. In this site, 38 relatives were buried together, and genetic testing revealed that 12 of them carried traces of the deadly bacteria, around 30%. That percentage mirrors the lower estimates of mortality seen during later pandemics such as the Black Death. What made their fate even more tragic was the type of plague they endured, pneumonic plague, the rarest but most lethal form, attacking the lungs so aggressively that an untreated victim could perish in as little as 2 days. Evidence suggests this strain may have been more common during that ancient outbreak than it is today, and it remains the only form of plague that spreads directly from one person to another through infected droplets in the air. It remains unclear whether this disaster was dominated by the pneumonic strain or if all three forms pneumonic, bubonic, and septicemic were circulating at once. Some of the earliest plague victims bear signs of multiple infections, pointing to a mix of types. Another puzzle is that the bacteria at that stage may not yet have developed the ability to survive in flea stomachs, raising questions about how it initially spread. One striking revelation from that family burial site was that the epidemic endured far longer than expected. The individuals did not all belong to a single generation, but rather stretched across 6 generations spanning roughly 120 years. This meant the disease had returned in at least 3 distinct waves. The first 2 outbreaks appear to have been relatively mild, but the third caused catastrophic devastation. Taken together, these waves were severe enough that some scientists argue they alone could account for the collapse of large Neolithic settlements. If that theory holds true, living in Eurasia during that time must have been horrific. Alongside the disappearance of many settlements came the halt of monumental building projects such as megaliths, since populations had dwindled to the point where there were too few people left to construct them. Mass violence also seems to have escalated in this grim landscape. Archaeological sites dating back 5,000 years reveal mass graves containing civilians, warriors, and even entire families brutally killed. Pandemics throughout history, both ancient and modern, have often been accompanied by spikes in violence and lawlessness, and this period was no exception. By some estimates, as many as 5 million people perished during this Neolithic catastrophe, numbers that, proportionally, made it deadlier than both the 1918 Spanish influenza and the modern AIDS pandemic. Yet, in a narrow sense, there was one small mercy. The strain of Yersinia pestis responsible for this ancient disaster was not as virulent as the one that unleashed the Black Death centuries later. Even so, recovery from the Neolithic decline was agonizingly slow. In certain regions, it took over 3,000 years for populations to return to their earlier levels. Still, not all scholars are convinced that plague alone explains this collapse. Studies of over 100 bones from Germany showed infection rates ranging only from 1.5% to 5%, far lower than in Scandinavia. These figures, while still high, suggest that the epidemic's severity may have varied greatly from region to region, devastating some areas while leaving others less affected. This has led many to propose that multiple causes worked together to produce the widespread decline. One theory argues that fear itself played a decisive role. During the late Neolithic, violence was rampant, with evidence of warfare so extreme that it may have left imprints on human genetics. According to this hypothesis, constant conflict drove people to gather in larger and larger settlements for safety. But overcrowding in these mega-communities reduced fertility, raised mortality, and set the stage for epidemics, ultimately pushing populations downward. Another explanation focuses on agriculture. As the global climate cooled during this era, crops may have failed more often, leading to famine, malnutrition, and further demographic decline. In reality, the truth may lie in a combination of all these forces: disease, violence, and food shortages working together to unravel human societies. Whatever the exact cause, the Neolithic decline stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, a time when survival itself became a daily struggle and entire ways of life vanished.